Foraging. It used to be an everyday necessity many 100 years ago. To be able to understand the local flora of where one lived and learning the difference between edible and poisonous plants was one of the only educational lessons that mattered. Nowadays, however, there's no need to have to learn the ways of the local plant life. The rise of agriculture and grocery stores provides us with all the food that we will ever need now. Despite this, though, I began to develop a fascination with foraging once I turned 16. Something about the idea of being able to provide for myself in the wild, if ever need be, soothed some primal lizard brain anxiety within me. So in light of the newfound passion, I began to purchase books about edible and medicinal plants in the region of the Midwest, where I live. The books were helpful due to the fact that they not only helped identify plants, they also disclosed where, how, and when to forage them. It honestly was so fascinating discovering how many of the common plants I see every day are actually edible or have medicinal value. I've always loved nature, but learning about how to safely interact with its plant life really seemed to help me become more in tune with my surroundings. Knowing what I know now, though, I wish I never had taken an interest in foraging. I wish I never decided to leave the house that day. I wish I never decided to take Hazel with me. I'm getting ahead of myself, though. To be quite honest, I know I am just stalling giving all this backstory. I think I still haven't quite fully processed and accepted the events of that day. Still so much to bear. So much horror to remember. I guess that's why I decided to write this out. To hopefully clear some of the fogginess and agonized screams from my head. Anyway, I better just get writing and get this over with. Here's my story. It all happened 2 weeks ago, on Tuesday, July 7th, 2020. Now, by now, I'd reached the point in summer where I didn't know what to do with myself, and with the addition of spring quarantine due to COVID-19, I was dangerously close to reaching my boredom breaking point. I was flipping through some of my foraging books when I came across a page about blackberries. I read about how around this time of year was a good time to start picking blackberries, and then, of course, it struck up the idea that I should go blackberry picking. The memory of a certain forest preserve I walked past a couple days ago where I saw an abundance of blackberry vines and bushes popped into my head. A little shot of exhilaration zipped through my veins at the thought of going foraging, and I quickly called up my good friend Hazel to invite her to come with me. And she agreed, just as enthusiastic about the idea as I was. And it wasn't long before both her and me were in my car and on our way to the forest preserve. I had been friends with Hazel ever since the first grade. She had a full head of curly ginger hair, beautiful amber eyes, and a pale face full of freckles. Her and I both bonded over our passion for nature, and that connection had kept us close for many years. Whenever I felt like going adventuring, I always made sure to extend the invitation to Hazel. I'd be lying if I said I hadn't developed feelings for her over the years. She was just so amazing in every facet. Her personality, her looks, her energy. All of her. Thinking about her now only leaves me with pain, though. Feels as though that one of the monstrosities, thorns, is stuck in my heart. I can't remove it, and I can't remove it. We arrived at the forest preserve in the late evening, right as the sun was starting to dip lower on the sky, leaving the forest in a golden glow that wouldn't last for more than an hour. "We should try to be quick about this," Hazel stated. "We shouldn't be out too long after dark." "Yeah, you're right," I agreed. "We can go back to my house once we've finished picking enough berries and maybe make some scones, or pie." Hazel smiled, her gorgeous smile, and nodded. We proceeded further into the preserve, following the path where I remember a lot of blackberry vines growing. Both of us had brought wicker baskets lined with a couple layers of cheesecloth to prevent the berries from staining anything. I remember the night so vividly now, and how peaceful it was. How beautiful. Hazel looked in the last golden rays of the day, the way her amber eyes sparkled in the sun for the last time. How could anything so amazing end the way it did? It was getting dark by the time we reached the grove. The last bits of sunlight slowly retreated to darkness. I hadn't been in this part of the preserve before due to the fact that you could only access it through a series of obscure paths that I didn't even know existed until that night. I didn't think either of us even really remembered the paths we took to get there due to the fact that we were just following where the blackberry vines took us. Both her and I stopped in awe at the sight before us. There was a circular clearing in the middle of the forest, and in that clearing, there must have been hundreds of blackberry vines. They were intertwined and locked in ways that made them look like one huge writhing mass. It was a couple of minutes before Hazel finally piped up. "This is awesome!" she squealed in delight while jumping up and down with a huge grin plastered over her face. "We'll have enough berries to last us until next July." "We sure will," I laughed in response to her joyful outburst. "But our baskets are already pretty full and it's getting pretty dark. Let's pick for a little longer and explore, but then we have to go back home. We can return another time." Hazel nodded excitedly at my response. I'm not sure how much of it actually went through her head, but it was acknowledgement nonetheless. We split up, each exploring and picking berries at our own section of the grove. I noticed Hazel was venturing deeper into the grove's center, awkwardly stepping over vines and shifting her body to avoid getting pricked by other thorns. I looked up from picking my own berries every so often to check out her and make sure she didn't trip, fall, or get stuck. I looked up to check on her one more time once my basket was filled to the brim, ready to call her back so we could make our way to the car. But stopped dead before I could even voice a word. Hazel was standing on the center of the grove, a look of confusion and slight worry plastered on her face, looking down on something. Concerned, I began to make my way to her, awkwardly maneuvering my way around the thorned vines. And once I reached the center of the grove, I looked at Hazel and gave her a worried look. She didn't even look up at me. She seemed to be fixated on whatever she was staring at. I followed her gaze to meet what was transfixing her, and it wasn't long before the same look on Hazel's face was reflected onto my own. At first glance, the bush looked just like any other blackberry bush we had seen. But the more you looked at it, the weirder things got. The stem and branches of the bush weren't the normal solid green of the other blackberry vines, and the bushes around it. I mean, yes, the vines were still green, but it was more of a translucent green, which revealed what looked like red veins running up and down under the skin of the plant's stems. Although red veins on a plant isn't something that's super uncommon, these were something different. The veins reminded me too much of the veins that you could see under the surface of human skin. The longer you looked at the veins, the more it looked like they seemed to be moving. It was as though the plant had blood flowing through it, like it would in a human body. The veins seemed to expand, contract, just slightly enough to be noticeable if you watched for long enough. In addition to this, attached to each stem, every 1/4 an inch or so, were large, hook-shaped thorns that shone a deep purplish red. Each thorn seemed to have its own vein attached to it under the skin of the stem. I guess this was likely where the deep purplish red color of the thorns came from. The leaves also seemed to have a similar appearance to the stems, with red veins that moved ever so slightly under the surface. The leaves themselves also seemed to be shaped differently from the bushes around it. They were larger, longer, and had serrated edges. The leaves looked so sharp, in fact, I was convinced that if I touched the leaves, they would pierce my skin with ease. Finally, there were the berries. Instead of there being multiple berries on one branch, there was only one hanging off the very tip of select branches. They were much larger than the berries of the surrounding bushes, but still shone the same deep purple color of a ripe blackberry. The strangest thing, though, was that in the center of each berry was one druplet that was 3 times the size of the rest of the druplets that made up the blackberry fruit. This one large druplet was divided into 2 by a horizontal slit that twitched slightly every so often in a way that reminded me of a muscle spasm. The whole bush itself gave off a strong odor of rotting fruit, despite the fact that all its fruit seemed to be at perfect ripeness, and pulsed with an energy I can only describe as malicious. After several minutes of silence, both Hazel and I simultaneously looked to each other with looks of serious concern and disgust. By this point, we both had noticed the smell and were covering our noses to try and block out the stench. "What in the holy hell is this thing?" Hazel exclaimed, disgust dripping in her tone. "I have no idea," I responded, equally disgusted and also slightly worried. "Did you notice the weird veins?" she quizzed. "Yeah," I responded. "They remind me of human veins." "Yeah, they do," she whispered back softly. I could see she had a plan hatching behind Hazel's amber eyes, one I was not so sure I was going to like. The idea of messing with his plant filled me with a dread I can't quite explain. "I'm going to break one of the stems, see if any liquid pours out," she declared with certainty. "I don't think that's such a good idea. This thing seems really wrong. What if it's poisonous?" I countered, my voice laced with caution and worry. Hazel seemed to consider my words for a moment before her face lit up, as though she remembered something. She pulled out a pair of brown leather cloths that were clipped to her belt, ones that I hadn't noticed before. "Here, I can wear these," she stated matter-of-factly. I was hesitant. Still not sure if touching it at all was such a good idea, but I just nodded, said nothing. God, I should have said something. I should have dragged her out of that grove and to the car, fighting tooth and nail if I had to, but I didn't. Now I've paid the price for my ignorance. Hazel put on the gloves, reached forward, grabbed one of the thicker stems where a lot of veins were visible, and snapped it. For a moment there was nothing. And then, thick, red liquid spurted out of the broken stem. The wound was bleeding as violently as a slashed human artery, covering Hazel in the gooey red substance that I now know to be human blood. The rest seemed to play out in slow motion. Hazel was swooped up by one of the plant's vines, lifting her high enough into the air so that I couldn't reach her. She screamed in agony as huge curved thorns tore into the flesh of her torso. I was so surprised that I couldn't even scream, let alone form any words. It wasn't long until several more vines shot up from the plant and wrapped around each of her limbs, stretching them out and holding them so she couldn't struggle or even move. Blood poured from where the vines connected with her flesh, dripping to the ground in a steady stream, similar to a shower with poor pressure. Her screams only became more tormented now due to the fact that they had grown to include notes of hoarseness as her vocal cords tore themselves apart, alongside what sounded like her choking on whatever fluid was filling her throat at the time. Still, I couldn't say anything. I couldn't even move. All my terrified body would let me do was watch the scene unfold in front of me. The plant had one last area it needed to restrain. Her head. And after a single vine shot up to wrap around her forehead, locking her head in place, streams of blood flowed from where flesh and thorn connected, making it look as though her own tears were made of blood. The only reason I could imagine for why it didn't just go for her neck was because the plant wanted her alive for this next part. The vines that had berries on them now began to join the horrid affair. Slowly, the large centered drupelets of berries opened their horizontal lids and revealed human eyes, all of varying shades of color, shape, and decomposition. They were lifted up to Hazel's face by green tendrils that extended from the tips of the berries corresponding to the vines. There must have been at least 20 eyeberries protruding from the bush. The eyeberries were feverishly examining her face, but more specifically, her eyes. Hazel tried to close her eyelids to protect her eyes from whatever the horror planned to do with them, but it would not have any of it. Several thin tendrils shot up from the bush, all of which had no berries attached. They forced her eyelids open. It was only a matter of seconds before Hazel's amber eyes were exposed to the peering plant once again. By this point, Hazel's voice had seemed to give, and the only sounds she could make included whimpering and gurgling. Her face was contorted into an expression filled with pain and fear. Her eyes showed this moment of all, however. They were filled with so many emotions I can only imagine what she felt in that moment. What was most twisted about all of this, though, was the fact that I could tell the plant was soaking up her pain with glee. The eyeberries wriggled around happily, almost as if they were dancing to her pain, soaking up every drop of her agonized expression. I wanted to do something. I wanted to rip that monstrosity out of the ground, tear it apart, but I couldn't. I was still trapped in my own mind, unable to move even a finger, in fear that the plant may notice me too. It was then that the horror began its next phase. All the eyeberries seemed to stop wriggling, stop scouring every inch of Hazel's form. They had come to a decision that would haunt me to the end of my days, a decision about what to do with Hazel. The eyeberries turned their forms to look down at the center, and both Hazel and I followed their gaze. From the center of the bush sprouted what must have been hundreds of thin, little green, writhing tendrils. And these tendrils were different from any of the others because of the fact they were extremely thin, no thicker than a fishing line, and seemed to work as a hive mind as the thin tendrils made their way up to Hazel's face. The eyeberries followed their movement. They didn't want to miss a second of the event. The tendrils examined Hazel's eyes, just like the eyeberries did, except I could tell the tendrils weren't emotionally fascinated by her eyes like the eyeberries were. They were more focused on mapping and understanding the anatomy of Hazel's two eyes. They poked and prodded her eyes in 1,000 different places, and each time they did, a separate whimper escaped Hazel's lips. This went on for a little while, and it wasn't until all the tendrils seemed to have gotten a feel for every part of Hazel's eyes did they stop. There were a few moments of silence, where every part of the plant seemed to hold as still as possible. I knew that this moment was the calm before the storm, and my suspicions were confirmed once the first tendril shot forward and buried itself in the corner of Hazel's eyes. A muffled scream rang out of Hazel's lips as the thousands of tiny tendrils followed the first lead, latching themselves along the edges of both Hazel's eyes. I watched in horror as all the tendrils found their places and began to pull outward. It became apparent to me now what they were trying to do. They were trying to pull Hazel's eyes out. Hazel's shrieks rang through the air once more, sending a new shockwave of unrelenting terror through my body. I watched as Hazel's eyes bulged from her head as the tendrils fought with her body for their own ownership, and with a sickening snap, her left eye popped from her eye socket, followed by another snap from her right eye. Her body fell limp as I watched the eyeberries wiggle with excitement. The tendrils quickly handed over what used to be Hazel's eyes to the eyeberries before returning to Hazel's body for more deconstruction. The thousands of tiny tendrils entered Hazel's eye sockets, causing Hazel's body to twitch as they explored all the veins, organs, and arteries. At this point, it became obvious the tendrils were draining her body of blood, as their light green color quickly turned a deep red as they transferred the precious liquid to the center of the organism. During all this, the eyeberries wasted no time in finding a new home for Hazel's eyes. They carried the eyes as though they were crowd surfing at a concert. They were the star. Down the rest of the plant, 2 unripe eyeberries, which had not come to life during the massacre, revealed themselves in the presence of the eyes. They were attached to vines that looked younger than the vines the alive eyeberries were attached to. As well as this, these berries also did not have a large druplet in their center. It was apparent that this was because those berries did not have any eyes to call their own yet. But that was about to change. The wriggling eyeberries passed Hazel's detached amber eyes into their unripe counterparts, and they were absorbed, hungrily. It wasn't long before their large center druplets formed, and the newborn pair of eyeberries saw the world for the first time with their stolen eyes. I locked eyes with the newborn berries, and I felt my stomach twist into a knot at the sight of Hazel's still bloody eyes being used by those monstrosities. We stayed there, eyes locked for what felt like centuries. It wasn't until I heard a sickening thud from next to me that I turned away from my grotesque staring contest. Hazel's drained body was splayed out before me, eyes empty, skin ghostly pale, emptied of all blood. All of her previous light and liveliness was gone, now replaced by a shell of what she used to be. Bile rose in my throat and I became sick, vomiting out all the previous blackberries I ate that night onto the soil. And when I finally looked up, I was met with a sight that made my blood run cold. All the Eyeberries had turned to stare at me. Cold, calculating, and unblinking. It was obvious this was the first time any of them noticed me, and were now deciding what to do about me next. I wasn't going to give them a chance. Before I knew it, I was on my feet and bolting for the direction of my car. Now in control of my muscles once more, I was halfway expecting to feel the Eyeberry vines wrapping around my feet and dragging me to a similar demise. But that didn't happen. I don't really remember what happened after that. One minute, I was frantically slamming my keys into the ignition and peeling out of the preserve's parking lot. The next, I was in my mother's arms, sobbing and spouting gibberish nonsense to her while she tried to understand what happened. I was rushed to the hospital after that. Apparently, I'd gotten some deep enough cuts to need stitches on my leg from running through the blackberry groves back to my car. The next morning, I gave my statement to the police. I told them everything I told you. They obviously thought I was crazy, but still went to investigate my claims just in case. They couldn't find any evidence of my story. The only thing they found was the blackberry grove. No eyeberry bush. No hazel. The only thing they found to prove that I was ever there in the grove in the first place were torn pieces of my clothing that got stuck on thorns of blackberry bushes following my escape path. And this left me the only suspect regarding the disappearance of Hazel. And because of this, I'm still being investigated to this day. I have no idea where the eyeberry bush could have gone, or what it did to the rest of Hazel, but I also know this. It's not done with me yet. When I returned home yesterday from yet another police interview, I was met with something that caused me to freeze in my tracks. It was one human eye. I know it was not one of Hazel's because it was too badly decomposed and had blue irises, but this is not the point. This freak of nature is sending me a message. My eyes are the same shade of blue as the one now sitting on my desk. And it doesn't take a genius to figure out that the monstrosity is telling me that it is in need of some new eyes. And that I am the perfect prey. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I just wanted to say thank you so much for watching tonight's video. Or watching tonight, or listening to tonight's podcast, because it's also a podcast on Spotify, or on Apple, or on Google, or anywhere else you can listen to a podcast. If you've all been curious about what I look like, and not just what I sound like, then you might be getting your chance to be able to see that. On Indiegogo right now, there is a project called Giggles Indie Horror Movie. The Giggles Indie Horror Movie is something that's spearheaded by Madame Macabre, and I'm sure you're all aware of her. It's a film that I've been asked to play one of the major leads in, and I'm super excited about it, so I hope that all of you are excited about it as well. You can check out the trailer there on the Indiegogo page, as well as a lot of the different effects and makeup that they're working on for this clown-themed horror film. And lastly, as always, I want to remind you guys, if you ever want to support the show, you can do so at patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta. And I really appreciate any time you guys can support the show, because honestly, I love you guys. You're all awesome. So, a very special thank you to Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Saha, Ken Lando Higuchi, Mazikeen, Chompski, TheRedOakShieldVirus, G Weevil 3, Diana Kraus, Stephen VanHuss, Chance Burnett, Tristain Pelton, Nico kaeo, The Ginger Bros, Last Blade Song, Caleb Dougal, Sky Harbor, The Homeless Bird 93, Bobby Karen, Liam Newman, Aaron Stormcrow, Barbara Maceo, Thomas Burgett, S-Man, Kiri the Sloth, Bad Honey, Someone You Love, Said the King 56, Shadow Morningstar, Mad Marstomp, Mr. Thud, Patrick Schoolmeister, Z. Kearley, Wolfie Nums, Rafael Rodriguez, WR Axis, Prozac and Pancakes, Mike Bullock, AcidSystem, Lauren, Brian Ars, and rumblefox. And also a huge thank you to everybody who's down there in the description down below. You guys, as always, are the real MVPs, and I appreciate you more than I can possibly say. So thank you guys, thank you all for listening, and sweet dreams.